So welcome to First Wednesdays. We're so happy to have you here, and oh my gosh, what a gorgeous day we had. So we're all happy to be outside and go into the library. Tonight is a very special event, and so we have many people to thank. So again, thank you so much to Vermont Humanities Council for giving us these wonderful, wonderful opportunities. And so I'd like to thank the statewide underwriters, which are the Alma Gibbs Staunton Foundation, the Wyndham Foundation, the Institute of Museum and Library Services through the Vermont Department of Libraries. Also, our local library sponsors, which of course are the Friends of the Library, also Against the Grain, Brattleboro Auto Body and Detailing, the Brattleboro Food Co-op, Brattleboro Savings and Loan, and Park Place Financial, just across the street. New Chapter, the Richards Group, and the Wyndham World Affairs Council. And the underwriters of tonight's talk are Carol and Jeff Gaddis, who happen to be in the audience. So let's give them a hand. Alrighty then. So I have been looking forward to this moment since I moved to Vermont, because I knew Reeve Lindbergh lived in Vermont, and I knew one of these days I'd be able to meet her. And I am so delighted to introduce our speaker tonight, the daughter of aviator and authors Charles A. and Anne Morrow Lindbergh. You may have heard of them. Reeve is also the author of more than 24 books for adults and children, which my kids grew up hearing as bedtime stories. They're most especially The Midnight Farm. And because they were night owls, they were very familiar with midnight, but not so much with farms. So thanks to Reeve, they got that. Her work has appeared in magazines and periodicals, including the New York Times Book Review, the New Yorker, the Washington Post, and she serves with a number of local, state, and national organizations, among them the Charles A. and Anne Morrow Lindbergh Foundation, the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation, the Vermont Arts Council, and her most recent book is Two Lives, a collection of essays published in 2018, including reflections about her life in Vermont and the complex history of her family. So please join me in welcoming Reeve Lindbergh.
Oh, good. Well, thank you very, very much for coming on this beautiful night when you could be doing all kinds of other things. And it's lovely to see all these nice faces. This little book, Two Lives, which is actually, it was published in April just 1 year ago, and with some little publishing company called Brigantine Media that was established by some friends of mine. They do textbooks, and they do business books, and they do books written by their friends. And I got on that list for last year. So I was able to pull together a collection of essays and writings that I've been doing for a couple of years. And it seems to me that everything I write that isn't for children, and I have written a number of books for children, pretty much rhyming books for very young readers, but everything that I write that isn't for children kind of turns into a memoir that has to do with my parents. I wrote one some years ago called Under a Wing. That was the first one, and that was about growing up in my family in Connecticut and kind of not really understanding what this was all about, which is kind of the way it's been for me growing up as a member of a Lindbergh family, one of my parents' 6 children, one of whom died in that horrible kidnapping long before the rest of us were born. But there were 5 of us growing up in Connecticut, and we were kept in a very, as much as possible, in a very private kind of a life. In other words, not overwhelmed by the kind of publicity that had really followed my parents and especially my father, since the flight to Paris and his meeting of my mother, the kind of attention that they had was overwhelming. And it made it difficult for them to live their own lives in kind of a normal way. So as we grew up, we knew that it was a little different. Our family was a little different. But I don't think we realized until we grew up and left home how much they had tried to shield us from the fame and the attention that they had gotten. But as I get older, I realize that I've spent my life trying to pull together their lives, what's a normal life, kind of now as I'm living in Vermont, and we live on a farm, and there are sheep and there are chickens, and we have a couple of funny old dogs, and we've raised a bunch of kids, and that normalcy is occasionally kind of pierced with something that comes from the Lindbergh past. And that's really what I'm writing about in this book, kind of very silly, normal, daily things, and that past that comes back and reverberates one way or the other. So, as I say for the title, I often think I live two lives, one in the foreground and the other in the background, each life taking its turn. I have a real or normal life in the country, where my husband and I live on an old farm at the end of a dirt road. We wear comfortable clothes, write books, raise sheep and chickens, are active in community life, and welcome our children and grandchildren whenever they come to visit. There is also an entirely different Lindbergh life, which requires putting on somewhat less comfortable clothes and traveling to places away from the farm where I attend meetings and give talks, and where there are no chickens except for the kind on the menu, followed by words like cordon bleu and à la king and Kiev. And in this second life, I stand up in front of groups of people and talk a little about the books I've written for children and adults, and a lot about the lives of my late parents, Charles A. and Ann Morrow Lindbergh. I have spoken about my parents on college campuses and Air Force bases, in museums and libraries and schools, to children and to adults around the country for decades. And when I've finished with the meetings and talks, I come home to Vermont, change clothes, and emerge from the limbo of travel and from my Lindbergh life, settle down with my husband, the dogs, the sheep, and the chickens, immersing myself in farm and community until the next time when I go put on my other wardrobe and I go out. It's maybe a strange way to live, coming and going and switching focus completely between one life and the other, moving from the present to the past, not even my own past, but my parents, and back again. But I've done this for so long that it feels like just another part of my routine, like going to the farmer's market or taking one of the dogs to the vet. One of the chief differences is that in my Lindbergh life, there are different questions to answer. Instead of, how long has she been limping? Or, do you want a bag for those? It's, what's your favorite memory of your father? Or, did your mother teach you to write? Or, what can you tell us about the kidnapping? Or, did your father really have other families? These questions are now so familiar they don't trouble me much, though I can remember when some of them did. I first began to live two lives not long after my father's death in 1974. Before that, my mother and father spoke for themselves, if they chose to speak at all, but most of their communication with the world was done in writing. Between the two of them, they published more than 20 books about their lives and reflections over the years. My father rarely spoke in public during my childhood in the late 1940s and the 1950s, though he had done so before I was born. He made speeches on behalf of the future of aviation after his 1927 flight from New York to Paris when he was in his mid-20s. And I just recently heard one of them. He spoke at the Library of Congress, and I was sent just a 33 RPM record, but I didn't know how to play it. I didn't have any place to play it. And a friend of mine who loves all this stuff did have a beautiful record player, could play the record and could record it and transmit it to a CD. So I heard my father at the age of 25 talking to the Library of Congress in this voice that I sort of remembered, but of course it was a much younger voice than I knew. I was born when he was in his 40s, and I remembered him talking really in his 50s and 60s. So here he was 25 years old. He was making jokes with all these congressmen, and I think of him as being so shy, but he was so pleased at being able to talk about the future of aviation. And he was there in Washington, D.C., and they recorded it, and I got to hear it, years after he had died. It was very thrilling, and it's one of the things that I love about doing what I do, about talking in different places about my father, is that I always have something that comes back. Somebody always tells me something that connects their life with my family, and that is really an extraordinary thing. It's very, very touching and very nourishing. I love that. My father rarely spoke in public during my childhood. He did after the flight when he was in his mid-20s, and he spoke out against America's entrance into the Second World War as part of the controversial isolationist movement when he was in his late 30s or so. And toward the end of his life, when he was in his 60s and I was in my teens and 20s, he began to speak out again about his growing concern for the environment worldwide and his conviction that we must achieve balance between technology, the rapid development of technology, which he loved, and the preservation of nature. He spoke in the House chamber in Juneau, Alaska, in support of a bill proposed for the protection of Arctic wolves. He spoke to a radio audience in the Philippines on behalf of what was then called the monkey-eating eagle, now the Philippine eagle, and recently the national bird of the Philippines. He gave a speech in 1973 at his boyhood home in Little Falls, Minnesota, in which he reminisced about summers sleeping on the screened porch of that home, not far from the banks of the upper Mississippi River. And the river is very small, very, very small and very kind of gentle and friendly in Little Falls, Minnesota, where his home was. And he slept on the screened porch on a cot with his dog, and they preserved that home. So when I went out later to look at the house, which I hadn't seen, I was, again, very touched to see how beautifully they preserved that home. And nothing fancy, but very much a farmhouse and very much attuned to the environment around them. And he always loved and thought back to that house and that farm. And he felt so pleased that toward the end of his life, his boyhood home was declared a national park, named in honor of his own father, C.A. Lindbergh, the first Charles A. Lindbergh. My father did not want it named for him. He said, "We will give you the land. We would love to give you the land for the national park, but could you name it in honor of my father?" And they did. I knew him best during what I think of as his conservation years, not the isolationist years before the war, not the very active early aviation years, but what I think of as the conservation years and what my mother called his last crusade. He traveled all around the world, again, as he once had on behalf of aviation, but this time on behalf of the environment and wildlife. He talked about his efforts to save the monkey-eating eagle in the Philippines and the blue whale in Japan and the wildlife of East Africa. He was so electrically energetic, always, that even when he was away, his influence remained and reverberated throughout the house. You could just feel it. My mother was a different story entirely. During my childhood, our father was present even in his absences. His energy, his rules, his discipline lingering in the house, as did the woodsy outdoor scent of his winter jacket in the hall closet. Our mother, however, had the ability to be absent within her presence. She was completely with me, especially if I needed her. She always listened to my stories, took my emotional and physical complaints seriously, and didn't disappear into the world for weeks or months the way our father did. Still, She could go deeply into herself when I was sitting right there next to her. Her eyes would look off and away through the window over the mudflats and marsh grasses of Long Island Sound, one hand fingering a brooch at her neck. I remember it as a cameo in a silver frame with a bouquet of flowers against a black background, all fashioned of tiny, colorful, semi-precious stones. I knew she was still there with me. She was also somewhere else. It was my mother who provided the steady, gentle background of my earliest days. In her knee-length floral printed dresses and her dark curly hair held up and back at the sides, and what I later learned was a common 1940s hairstyle. And if you look at films of that era, you'll know what I'm talking about when I say it was a kind of an upward roll on two sides of the face with another one over the forehead. Her coiffure was looser, curlier, and much less Hollywood glamorous than Betty Grable's or Ava Gardner's. But her hairdresser may have been trying for the same effect. My mother spoke in public occasionally when invited to do so by an organization with which she was associated or family members and friends. She liked to read out aloud a piece she'd carefully written ahead of time for something like an alumni program at Smith College, her granddaughter's graduation at Middlebury. I was there. It's a wonderful talk. Or a talk given to members of the Cosmopolitan Club in New York City. And the ladies were all there, and she talked about all the different ages she had been and how it was a little bit like musical chairs. And every time I read that talk, I love it. It makes me laugh. She really had a wonderful gift for doing talks, but she was very shy about doing it. She was much more comfortable speaking with people one-to-one than standing up and talking to a group. But she was really good at it. And, she had that way. She was always talking about writing about how she didn't write. I noticed this when we put together a volume of her diaries and letters after she died. My brother and I and a friend of ours who was an editor got together a great deal of material, diaries and letters from, I think it was 1947 to 1986, which was a period she hadn't collected those letters. She collected the early letters, the flight letters, and the war letters, and so on. But she stopped right after the war, and we felt that there was this great section of her life that wasn't represented. So we gathered these letters. We went to Yale. We found it, which is where all their papers are, all the papers from their life together, surely. And we brought them together, and what I couldn't believe was how often she eloquently, elaborately, and at great length wrote about how she wasn't writing. Beautifully. And I just wished I could have told her, you were writing. But there were some beautiful letters and some wonderful back and forth between them. And as she got older, she was much more feisty, I think I will say. She would say, Charles, I don't want to do this. I want to go see my grandchildren. I'm not going to meet you to go to the Philippines and talk about the monkey-eating eagle. I will be with my child and her child. That would be my sister. But in any case, she didn't speak in public very often. Over the course of his lifetime, my father made quite a few speeches, but he would kind of slip away afterwards. And there was never a question period after their talks, which is the part actually I love best, because then I can hear what people want to know and I can respond with something that might make sense to them. And I enjoy that a lot. But my father disliked being questioned to begin with. And he had been uncomfortable with what he called the press ever since the flight to Paris in 1927. And my mother said that once, when they were about to embark on one of their very early survey flights, a reporter begged her husband to reveal at least which direction they were planning to take on this journey. And my father grinned and said, up. Let's see. As I said, unlike my parents, I do like to have a question period afterwards. And sometimes a tactful moderator will ask whether there are things I prefer not to talk about, questions that might be painful or difficult. And I'll always say that I will answer any questions to the best of my ability, although there may be questions to which I don't know the answer. But a wonderful thing that's happened to me after many years of speaking to people is I've lost my fear of answering questions and have gained the great freedom of simply telling the truth as I know it, as far as I know it. I'm pretty sure I'm not alone in living two lives. I think most people do this to some degree. When a person gets up in the morning and goes to school or to work, he or she leaves an at-home self behind. Salespeople have salesmanship selves, and office workers have at-the-office selves, and any teacher, whether in kindergarten or college, has developed a teaching self. A teacher needs to be on in a certain way, just the way an actor is on for theater, film, or television. And when the school day is over, or the cameras have stopped rolling, or the stage lights have dimmed, you can be off and just yourself again. I watched my daughter, who lives in Arlington, Vermont, and is a French teacher. And I watched her come into her teaching self. And she's a French teacher. So when she is at home with her husband and her son, she is Lizzie Lindbergh. She married a man called David Lindbergh, another teacher. And so for a while we were calling her Lizzie Lindbergh, although Lindbergh was her middle name. But anyway, she became Madame Lindbergh. And she just was another person. I watched her with the kids, and the kids would stand up and say, Madame Lindbergh. And she would say, oui? I thought, oh my goodness, who's this? But you do have a second self, I kind of think we all have to, one way or another. I think I don't ever completely go off, in a sense. In a sense, I think that even when I think I'm completely free of it, that Lindbergh life will seep into my everyday existence at very unexpected moments. And then I have to move from that kind of low-key, daily consciousness concerned with things like laundry and shopping and working in the garden. And then I have to step into Lindbergh mode, I think of it. There was a day, not too long ago, and there are many days that are like this, but I received 2 requests, one from a group hoping to name their in-flight magazine Lindbergh, quote, because we believe that Charles Lindbergh personified the pioneering spirit, intelligence, and elegance the magazine will strive for, and another for an interview to discuss my father's flight to Paris. I was able to respond to both requests. In the first case, the family follows my parents' policy not to use their names or likenesses for commercial purposes. It sometimes happens anyway, but the policy was not to do that. And I'd be glad to talk to the historian about my father's flight to Paris, but it happened 18 years before I was born. And everything I knew about it comes from his book. My father rarely even mentioned the flight to me, and if I asked him about it, he would say, read my book. That was the answer. And eventually I did. I read all his books and all my mother's, and I keep on reading them because I need to. Most of the ongoing Lindbergh literary responsibilities came to me after my parents had both died, because I've worked with editors and publishers in my own life for many years. And I've dealt a lot with my mother's and father's letters and manuscripts and archives. So even though my father's been gone for more than 40 years and my mother for 18, something like that, their written words continue to reverberate for me, and their lives kind of trail long tendrils across mine. I actually like it. It means a lot to me. Lots of people are just as interested in my family as I am. Some of them are much more interested than I am. But those Lindbergh researchers and biographers and scholars have been so helpful in supplying dates and times and verifying the accuracy of my own memories. How old was I when my father and I had a forced landing together? What year was it that my mother became the first licensed female glider pilot in the United States? I think I was 7 when we had that forced landing, and I think it was 1930 when my mother became the first licensed female glider pilot. She loved gliding. She loved it more than flying, she said, because there was no noise. And she said, you feel part of the earth in a way that you can't feel except in that medium. And she absolutely loved being a glider pilot. I used to pester A. Scott Bird with questions when he was writing Lindbergh, his Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of my father. I was writing my first memoir, Under a Wing, about growing up in the family. Scott also asked me questions. And once, because I had expressed astonishment at hearing how many boxes of material he proposed to go through at the Lindbergh collection at the Sterling Library at Yale. 700. There were 700 archival boxes. He almost complained to me about some of the material he discovered, items that had been saved by my parents and sent to the university to be kept there in perpetuity. Was it really necessary, he wondered, to save carbon copies of handwritten notes to our teachers, excusing us from school for dental appointments? Small squares of blotting paper, probably made by cutting one of my mother's large desk blotters into smaller pieces, and each square covered with the indecipherable reverse blottings of words from letters or diaries or grocery lists. Did I have any ideas about all this? So I told him, because I could not resist, that at our house during my high school years, there were always 2 cardboard boxes sitting at the top of the stairs to the basement. Next to the basement was the attached garage where my father kept the station wagon he used for local errands, and he drove this car to New Haven when he carried documents to Yale archives. One box at the top of the basement stairs was labeled Yale for the station wagon. The other box was labeled Dump. Could the labels have been switched? I think he would have hung up on me, says Scott Berg, if he hadn't been so well brought up. But it did sometimes seem to me that my father and mother either didn't know how to separate archival material from what should be garbage, not true, or didn't have time to sort the material carefully before bringing the next load of boxes to Yale. But my father was usually so meticulous in his habits that I was surprised at some of the things we found when I visited the library a few years ago with my brother and our niece and a friend and assistant editor. We were there to help the archivist make sense of some of the more questionable items in the Lindbergh collection. There were folders full of brochures for summer camps that we children had attended over the years. And there were brochures for summer camps that we had not attended. There were my brother Land's kindergarten paintings, about which he expressed the opinion that our mother had always had a feeling for fine art. And there were pale slips of mimeograph notices announcing PTA meetings and teachers' conferences at our schools. None of the archivists at Yale had felt they could discard this material without permission from the family. Poor archivists. We weeded out a good deal of it, although I'm not sure we ever dared to discard any of the kindergarten paintings. So despite my occasional complaints, I'm still fascinated by the celebrity that surrounded my parents for most of their lives, no matter how hard they tried to escape it. I have one impulse to explore this phenomenon further, and another one that wants to do exactly the opposite, fight against it, wrestle it down to human scale by bringing into the picture everything familiar and genuine that I know about my parents. My father's toothbrush, his comb, he had one of those plastic ace combs, small one, pocket comb, and the handkerchief in his pocket, the bright Mexican ribbons my mother wore in her hair, her underwear and stockings dripping delicately over the shower curtain railing in the bathroom, the horse chestnuts she kept in her coat pocket, shining deep mahogany from the invisible rubbing of her thumbs. We had horse chestnut trees lining the road where I lived in Connecticut, and the horse chestnut would fall on the ground and drop open, and then they had these lovely little nuts. And if you rubbed them with your thumb over time, they would glow and felt wonderful. But it seems to me now that fame, like disease or war, is a kind of enemy of normal human life, and was for my parents during their first years together. I was ignorant in my childhood of something that became clear to me later. My parents had no wish to live in the past for many reasons, but the greatest of these must have been that their early adventures were followed by the terrible tragedy of the kidnapping death of their first child, Charles, in 1932. After that, their lives changed completely. They left America, living for a time in England and in France with my older brothers, and they shunned all forms of publicity for the greater part of their lives. Having been robbed of normalcy in a terrible way early on, they understood it for the treasure that it is and tried their best to offer this treasure to their children as we grew up. How little I appreciated their efforts. I hated having to memorize a false surname when we were on vacation. Scott, they chose, or Spencer, names close enough to our family to remember, although I always forgot which one we were using at the time. And there's a story I wrote somewhere about, this was true, I think we were in Vermont, but I was quite young, and I was on a kind of a bunny slope, the baby slope of a ski place, and one of my brothers was nearby. But I fell down, I just went clunk and fell down. And somebody rescued me and pulled me up, and I was just kind of there. And the person asked me, now what's your name, little girl? I said, just forget. And then they thought I had concussion. and luckily my brother came and said, it's okay, she's always like that. But that was very annoying having to memorize all that. So the amount of attention that comes to me because of my parents' fame now is just, it's nothing. It's a tiny fraction of what they must have faced every day when I was growing up even. But when the past comes calling, whatever my circumstances may be at the time, I immediately snap into Lindbergh mode. I can't help it. A couple of years ago, and he's fine, so my husband was diagnosed with bladder cancer. A tumor was surgically removed the same day, a second surgery followed, and we were plunged into what I think of as cancer limbo, the time when families know the disease has struck but have yet to find out the prognosis. I was thinking about my husband all the time and driving back and forth with him to the hospital. We went down to Dartmouth Hitchcock from where I am, feeding the sheep and chickens, trying to keep our spirits up, and the two of us fed. He's the cook in the family, and he's much better than I am. So I was just trying to keep the standards up. And some of the kids arrived to help out, and there was an intense period of communication within the family. At the same time, a friend received an email message from a woman who knew that he knew me, and my friend sent the message my way, as she'd requested. And the woman's late father had always thought he might be the missing Lindbergh baby. So his daughter attached several photographs to the email to show how much this man had thought he looked like my father. I couldn't see the resemblance, so he was certainly good looking, and his daughter loved him dearly and respected his beliefs. It might have seemed odd to be able to move into Lindbergh mode that week, but I did it, just because I always do. And the only answer I had for this woman was one that would disappoint her, I know. And I've had communications for a long time with people who believe that either they or a relative is really my long-lost brother. Mm-hmm. But I never had a long-lost brother. There was a dead child, my brother Charles, whose body was found and identified by his doctor and by my father and others. And it must have happened right away, right after he was taken from his home. But my mother thinks he fell, and that's what she thought. But in any case, people have come back with the idea of a mystery. And for us, that the truth is just that a very young child died. And it was heartbreaking, and it seemed to happen because of my father always felt it happened because of the fame and celebrity. And I'm not sure my parents ever got over it, but it affected them individually differently. I don't know how much they actually talked about it. But my mother wrote a bit about it. But the fact and manner of my brother's death still shocks me every time something makes me think of it. Though he died more than 80 years ago, long before I was born, and I can certainly sympathize with somebody else's difficult family story, and I'm sorry that somebody else has been concerned with and worried about a parent's identity because of that tragedy. It makes me sad. But during our time of this medical intensity and cancer limbo, we received many messages and phone calls from lots of loved ones. And I got a call from a half-brother in Europe. I was unaware of his existence until 2003, when I traveled overseas to meet my half-brothers and half-sisters who were children of my father's relationship with 3 women he had come to know after the Second World War. They knew each other. 2 of them were sisters. The other was a friend. And I found out about them through a letter from one of the half-brothers. And he felt very strongly that the situation should remain private. I didn't even know there was a situation until I read the newspapers. One of the families whose mother had died wanted very much to come out in public and to meet us and to, to kind of, I think probably in a sense to normalize their situation. And the others were much more private and quiet and they didn't want any publicity, which was interesting. And I went and met everybody, which was quite wonderful, in fact. I went to Europe and traveled from home to home and met all these brothers and sisters who were many years younger than I. And they had their own children, young children, and I really liked them. And I very much liked the one woman, the one mother who was still living, whom I met, and liked her a lot. And that just was very odd. There I was, traveling around, meeting these unknown children of my father that I had never even heard about. I had no idea there were these relationships. But I got to be very close to one of these brothers. And we would talk about once a month. And when I told him that my husband had this cancer, he sent cards and letters. He told me various information that he had through scientific friends about this cancer. And I was so delighted to have this person, this brother, whose existence I didn't even know about, to help me the way my American brothers did in this difficult time. And as I was reading his postcards and thinking about his warm-hearted concern, and having just finished my email to the woman who thought that her father might be my parents' first child, I thought, I do have a long-lost brother after all. So that's another kind of completely unexpected thing that happened, and I'm very glad about it. I can't say that I understand how that all happened, and I have no idea what I'd say to my father if he were here. I would say, I just have no idea. And I'm sure he wouldn't have any idea either. But it's extraordinary what this other life, how it blends in with my own life, and how many kinds of insights it brings. So I also wrote quite a bit about things about chickens. I don't know, I think I might spare you the chickens. Yeah, I think I will. It's fun. There's a whole thing about bringing some chickens that belong to some friends of ours who live in town, and their chickens are very beautiful and very well brought up. Gorgeous. And they came to our end of the road farm and met the rooster. Ay, ay, ay. And when they went back home, my friend up in town said, actually, I said, I'm really sorry. And he said, oh no. He said, they're really sad. They're kind of depressed. It's been 2 weeks since they were here. He hasn't called and he hasn't written. So we have long stories of chickens over the years, and I, if there are too many roosters, my husband, who is actually a Vietnam veteran, and had to do that actually when he was stationed in a little village during the war. He said, "Oh, it's okay. I'll wring their neck." So he did that. He made wonderful soup, and we have eaten the eggs and we've eaten the chickens, and I don't do the killing part, but he has no problem with it, and he makes a very nice soup. So, but I think that's enough about my chickens. Oh no, the last part was that at a certain point in our lives, you know how we kind of get older and things are achy and creaky, and he has a sort of arthritic thing or perhaps more than that, he has a little problem with a knee, and he said, oh no, that's just that I jumped out of a helicopter in Vietnam, and I twisted and his doctor said, it's arthritis. He said, no. But in any case, they gave him injections. Well, they have these injections, Simvisc, and which is great. It puts some kind of a gelatin around the bone. And I realized that after 40 years of keeping chickens, my husband has rooster comb in his knee. And a great help it is. And I write a little about trees, and I write, oh dear, Okay, I'm going to have to read you this one. This is short. I won't read you all of it. But I wrote about, because I talked about getting creaky. Here we go. And this little one is called Migrations, and it's about things that change. And it starts, where did my eyelashes go? Didn't I have eyelashes? I mean, more than just a few, sparsely scattered. They've always been there, haven't they? They used to be attached to my eyelids in some quantity, with enough thickness available to pull on when I got a speck of dust in my eye, and that special way of pulling I was taught as a child. You grab the lashes between thumb and forefinger, and you pull the eyelid out and away over the top of your cheek, and then you let it go, and the speck is usually gone. The other day I had something in my eye, and I tried that eyelash pulling remedy, but it was really hard because the eyelashes themselves were gone. It was as if somebody had come along and pruned them like little carrot seedlings in the vegetable garden, taking every other plant. Pruned eyelashes. But I need them, I thought. I need them to protect me from the specks of dust and pet hairs and bits of grit and sand that are kicked up to eye level by wheels or feet or paws moving in my vicinity. I also think they come in handy when I'm blinking. Besides, I'm used to having eyelashes, though I suppose I've never done much for them or with them. I'm not an eyelash batter, and it's been many years since I used mascara and eyeliner, mostly because I never really got the hang of it, and I always ended up looking less like the wide-eyed beauty on the eye makeup ads and more like a startled baby raccoon. I was actually pretty worried about the loss of my eyelashes. How could I have lost my eyelashes? Eyeglasses. Yes, I lose those all the time. But I keep several pairs, and when I lose them, I usually find them again pretty soon. But eyelashes, how and where was I going to find those? Well, guess what? I did find them. They were on my chin. Oh dear. So I won't go further with that, but it's just the things that happen. I remember when my husband, he had a garden scarecrow that he made many years ago when he first moved to the farm, a figure he'd constructed with crossed sticks and straw stuffed into an old shirt and a pair of blue jeans. And then he patted the scarecrow to look like a facsimile of himself, a tall, strong young man with arms waving away all the garden predators. One summer, recently, he noticed that most of the straw in the scarecrow's upper half had sunk down toward its middle, settling in the belly area. He was just about to repair the figure with new straw, improving its physique, when he happened to look down at his own midsection. And he decided that the scarecrow's appearance was just about right after all. So we kind of get used to ourselves. We get used to our various changes and so on, and some of them are surprising, and some of them, you don't really have to look at. But we're doing fine. I wrote a little bit about the flowers in my grandmother's garden and my mother's garden and mine, and that's kind of a quiet little piece. But I wrote a little bit also about the airplanes and the actual airplanes, seeing the airplanes at the Air and Space Museum, which I do periodically. And first, my mother never flew in the Spirit of St. Louis. This always seemed odd to me, though I knew that my father's most famous aircraft was built to hold just one person, the pilot, and there wasn't much room to spare. The idea was to carry enough fuel for the 1927 flight from New York to Paris and to save weight in every other way. And some people called it a flying gas tank because that's pretty much what it was. It certainly wasn't designed to carry passengers. Still, in the flight log my father kept for the Spirit, which is at the back of his book, The Spirit of St. Louis, he has the flight log, a number of people are listed as having flown with him in that plane, one at a time, and usually for no longer than 10-15 minutes. Having looked at that very compact cockpit where my father's 6 foot 2 inches must have felt confined already, I always wondered where he put these people. On his lap? And how hard was it to fly the plane with somebody else in there with him? According to aviation legend, the Spirit of St. Louis was not an easy plane to fly with or without passengers. I've heard a story about the creation of the Spirit of St. Louis flying replica for the film with Jimmy Stewart. And apparently the people who built the replica followed the original specifications, and those are also in the back of my father's book. They followed very carefully and believed they'd successfully copied the airplane. However, when the plane was finished and it was time for the first test flights, something seemed terribly wrong. The replica was unstable in the air, the pilot reported. It shook and shuddered constantly. If the pilot allowed his attention to stray for an instant, the Spirit would stray off course. What had they missed? While they were still pondering this, my father visited the set. He wanted to see the flying replica of the Spirit. In fact, he wanted to fly it. So after a certain amount of discussion and concern and maybe a little panic, the decision was made that he should fly the replica. He knew a thing or two about the original. Maybe he could figure out what was wrong. My father took off with the Spirit replica while a group of anxious people waited on the ground below. He was gone for 5 minutes and then 10 minutes. Everybody expected him to come down and get all upset with them. But he was gone for a long time before he finally brought the little plane into land. And when he emerged from the cockpit, he said, "I had forgotten what a wonderful little plane that was." And then he said, "And you got it perfectly in every detail." And there, I guess the consensus is that he had to be able to stay awake. You know, it was 33 some odd hours from New York to Paris over the ocean at night. And the instability, to some extent, was built in on purpose. So after the flight to Paris, when the plane had become as famous as the pilot, some notable individuals are listed, including Henry Ford, flying from Ford Airport in Detroit, Michigan. That was his first flight in an airplane. And for August 12th, from the same airport, my father records one flight carrying Mother. That was his mother, not my mother. And some of the backers were people who put up the money for the flight were there. And in December of the year, following his flight to Paris, my father flew the airplane from the United States to Mexico for a brief but significant visit. He began his trip in Washington, D.C., and as he flew along, he followed his customary practice of finding his way in the United States, using road maps and local landmarks, like railroad stations that bore the names of various towns. And in those days, he could basically just follow railroad tracks from town to town and figure out where he was. So when he crossed the border into Mexico, it seemed reasonable to fly low over a railroad station. When he looked for the name of the first town on the railroad station, he saw this word, Caballeros. And he checked the Mexican map for the location, but he could not find any town called Caballeros. So he flew to the next town, found the railroad station, and discovered another sign, which also read Caballeros. And he said he flew over 3 Mexican towns before he realized that Caballeros meant men's room. But he did make his way to Mexico City, where he was greeted by his host, Ambassador Dwight Morrow, and by the Morrow family, including the children. Among them was my mother, Anne. And at this point, my father and the aircraft were well known enough that crowds would kind of overrun if they were able to, would kind of overrun the plane. And they had some damage in Paris, of course, and what they did was they would take it away quickly. And he did not fly. If he took somebody up flying in places where there was that kind of population and a lot of people running in to get close to the plane, he would have it would be put away in a hangar during the time he was visiting. And so he took the family flying in a big Ford, I think it was a Ford tri-motor, big aircraft, and they loved it. But he took my mother flying then, and then he came to visit her, and he took her flying in a de Havilland Moth, flying out of a horse pasture in Long Island. And then their engagement was announced in February of 1929, and they were married in Englewood, New Jersey. So he taught her to fly, and she loved it, loved glider flying above all, and she became a skilled pilot and navigator and radio operator of regular fixed-wing aircraft, and then they took off to survey for the early airlines all over the world. They went up over the North Pole to Asia in 1931, and it was a Lockheed Sirius seaplane that they named Tingmasartok, which was an Inuit word for he who flies like a big bird. They went down the coast of Africa. They were all through South America. And one of the things that she loved was meeting the people who had never seen airplanes before. They were, especially when they were in places like Aklavik and Point Barrow, Alaska, people would give them things. If you go to the Air and Space Museum, they have an exhibit of all the things, some of the things that they carried with them in the airplane. They tried to keep things light, of course, but they were given sealskin boots, and they were given little treasures that people had made, and they wanted to give something back to the people in Point Barrow, Alaska. My father found an orange in the pocket of his flying suit, and he offered it to one of the women. And my mother saw her holding it as if it were a jewel, and she realized they haven't seen an orange, if at all. It took so long for food to come in, and they had just been traveling with this orange in their pocket, and they gave it to her. It was as if they'd given her a ruby. So it was one of the many miracles that aviation offered to the remote corners of the world. So they traveled, and they loved it, and they I'm thinking about, I love those boots, those little boots that you can see in the aircraft. But I also was shown some of the clothing that my mother wore was given to the Air and Space Museum. So not just the clothing that she wore while flying, but clothing that she must have wrapped up and worn at various embassies and here and there. And she has beautiful dresses. And I thought, if I could just take that home and iron it, it would be so beautiful. But it belongs to the Air and Space Museum. So when you go and see that, just remember that that's my heritage there. I'm not going to fly the planes, but I would love some of those dresses. They're beautiful. And when I looked at some of the photos of their some of the things that they had, I had the same feeling I've experienced recently when looking at the equipment and the clothing, that this was part of somebody's wardrobe, somebody's life, and much closer to me than I've ever appreciated. I used to keep the museums at arm's length, wanting to maintain the distance between the public story and my private recollections. And now I go looking for all the things I used to try to stay away from. That careful separation between family life and my parents' historical life seems less clear and, in a way, less necessary. The kind of sweetness in discovering traces of what I knew in a museum or a university or a town I haven't been before, just the way there's a sweetness in finding a touch of my mother or my sister and looking at my daughters and their certain high forehead and twist of the mouth, or a look of my father and my son. So I found in visiting the airplanes a kind of understanding of my parents' marriage that I didn't comprehend when I was growing up. I knew my father was away from home more than other fathers seemed to be, and I was aware that it could be difficult for the whole family, including my mother, when he was home, walking and talking with so much energy and taking control of the house, which she managed perfectly well in her gentle way while he was away. I don't think the years of my childhood were for my parents much like the years when they flew over the world together. But I love the home my family shared with my mother and father, and the life we had growing up in Connecticut, even with him coming and going so often, and even though sometimes life was full of unexpected excitements and disturbances. But sometimes, when I think about it, I understand when my brother once said thoughtfully, long after both of our parents had died, he said, "I never should stop flying." So that's the way I think about it. Some of the way I think about it. And I don't know, you might have some questions. Some questions. Yeah.
I was in Maui on a bike tour in '74 with a Sierra Club group, and we saw your father's grave.
Yes.
and I wondered why Maui was chosen. It's a beautiful spot.
It is a beautiful spot. My father chose to be buried in Maui because he visited a friend of his, Sam Pryor, who was an aviation friend, and just for a little while, he and my mother visited Sam, and he was offered a parcel of land. My father fell in love with that spot right by the ocean, and he built a little house there, and actually not very far from the graveyard. And when they would walk up the road, he kind of loved the church and the graveyard and a piece of it, and he chose to be buried there. The family has gone back. I've been there quite a few times, but I have a niece who lives there now, and she is both a yoga teacher and the caretaker for that graveyard and for some other areas around. So she's very connected with that property. And my mother did not want to be buried actually anywhere. She was cremated, and she wanted to be scattered in all these different places that she would love. So her children, she was a little in Vermont and a little bit off the shore of that place where she lived in Connecticut, and a little bit near Captiva Island in Florida. And that was the way she wanted to be. But that was it. He wanted to be there, and he planned his grave with the gravedigger, a fellow wonderful Hawaiian man named Tebi Kahanawaki. And he told him, they sat together. This is my father. He planned everything. He planned this trip as carefully as the trip to Paris. And he said how deep it should be and what the rocks should be like. And my mother would occasionally say, well, could we plan a little of this? And he said, yeah, that sounds good. He had her singing hymns for a small ceremony, but she wanted to have a ceremony. And he said, we don't want anything. Don't worry about that. But she really wanted to have some kind of a ceremony. And she would sing the hymns she remembered from childhood. And she told me that every so often you would say, not that one's too corny. So he did plan this, and that graveyard. I mean, clearly it's very strong and very deep and beautifully planned and well cared for. But it was because of his friend that he ended up on Maui. Anybody else? Yes, sorry.
I'm just curious about where you lived in Connecticut, because I was growing up here about the same time you were.
Oh yeah, we lived in Darien, Connecticut, right on Long Island
I
Sound.
know where it is, I grew up in New Canaan.
There we go.
In your father's concern about wildlife and the natural world, did he make any connection in some way to the natural world being threatened, and specifically American capitalism?
I don't know if he would have talked about it that way. I think he talked about global. I mean, he would have been right there with the global warming concerns. But his worry was that he watched the aviation that he loved, and he was afraid that it was creating as many. I mean, naturally, that the kind of transportation and easy travel, all the things that he had thought were so important and so positive, and he always did. But he said, we have to be careful, we have to balance, we have to watch what's happening, and we have to be sure that we're not destroying qualities of greater worth. But I don't remember him talking specifically about American capitalism. He worried about American consumerism. He talked a lot about that, about people buying things they didn't need.
That's it.
Yeah, that was what he talked about.
Yeah.
And then, oh dear, and then we used to play Monopoly, and he would write things on the Monopoly board. And what was it? He tended to be Republican, and he wrote, in one place he wrote, Democratic administration, pay all your money in taxes. But he wasn't always, it was interesting. He was one of those people who felt that if you believed in something, he wasn't a party guy. but I would say he tended to be more Republican. My mother tended to be more of a Democrat. And the night before the election, when Adlai Stevenson ran for president, my mother left his book, Stevenson's book, on my father's bedside table and said, I just want you to read a little of this. And he read the whole thing, and he voted for Stevenson. Yeah. So that's the way he lived.
Hi, could you talk a little bit about the land in Montana? Did that come into your family through your dad, or is that?
The land in Montana was my father and my brother bought it together. And it was the ranch where in Missoula, not in Missoula, in Greeno, but near Missoula, Montana, where my brother ran a cattle ranch for many years. And my father thought it was a terrific investment for family and for all kinds of things. And so he was involved in that purchase. And my brother ran it for many years, and then when he retired, it was sold to somebody else. He still actually lives in that area along the Blackfoot, but much just in a cabin. Yeah.
Given that your life's work has been your family, could you maybe hypothesize what your children would write about you?
Oh, I have no idea. I have no idea.
Their perspective.
My children are all over the. I mean, there's one in Vermont teaching, one in California teaching, and a son in New York who's partly teaching. And my husband has 2 boys in Montana and some grandchildren. I don't know what they'd say. They'd probably say, boy, she had certainly thought a lot about her parents and her family. So maybe we'll do something different. I'm not sure. Don't know. Yeah.
Could you tell us more about your family's long-term connections to Vermont?
Well, in terms of I wish they were longer. As far as my connections, I just had the connection through the ski trips. My mother had family, not in her siblings, but I think an aunt who lived in Vermont, and my husband's family settled in Vermont. So there was his name is Nathaniel Tripp, and there was an Augustus Tripp homestead here. I've even forgotten where it was, but he was always interested, and I just left Vermont from what I'd known about it, and moved up to teach with my first husband, and couldn't imagine leaving after that. It was a while ago. Yeah.
I went to Whitingham High School in the 60s, and I had an English teacher by the name of Richard Brown.
Richard Brown. Yeah, that's what my first husband.
Yes. And he told us a story about going up in a plane in Vermont with your dad.
Oh, yes.
And just how thrilling that was. And I don't know at that point if I was that thrilled to hear about it, but when I got home and told my parents, they were just wild about it.
He was my husband, Richard Brown, my first husband, who was a great guy and photographer. And he, I remember my father, when he came to visit us, my father would take him flying because Richard was just beginning to really get into photography. He'd always loved it, but my father had an old Leica that Richard used, and Richard had his own, a Nikon, and they would fly they flew out of an airport a little airport in Berlin, Vermont, and they would go, Richard would want to go down, get a little closer down here, and my father would say, well, then just tell them you took this one with a telephoto lens. He would kind of slip down to get it, but he loved it. He told us it was like flying when he first started flying. Flying around Vermont was like flying in the early days, because it was easy. It was they rented a plane, and it was a great aircraft. But he said that the feeling of it, the feeling of flying over the land was like flying in the early days. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you have that book with you? The more?
Do I have? Oh, I have about a dozen copies. I didn't think there'd be this many people, but I do. They're for sale for $15 to Brigantine Media, but I can also I mean, if anybody would like a copy, they're online. Brigantine, like the ship, and media, and they're in St. Johnsbury, Vermont. But if somebody's really dying to have one, we've got 12 copies here. So, yeah.
Do you or your siblings fly?
I have a couple brothers who have flown. Nobody who's in the business. I have a nephew, Reeve Lindbergh, who is very much a flyer and talks very much the way my father did about what he sees. And he's gotten very much involved in green aviation, and is he's a neat guy. He actually could barely walk for a long time. He had a kind of arthritis when he was a young man that was very, very tough, and has, through medication and various kinds of exercise and so on, he does beautifully. And if you, Eric, E-R-I-K, and he has a website. He's alive, so if you want to look for a Lindbergh aviator, he's the one. Yeah.
First, I love listening to you, and
Oh.
thank you for helping me to figure out what happened to my eyelashes.
Oh, yeah. I get really silly. I'm sorry.
Oh my goodness, I'm always going, oh my God.
Where'd they go? Yeah.
I was wondering about, you mentioned about your family was very careful to shield you, given all the press.
They did. Yeah. I didn't even know how much
You
they
didn't know what was happening.
didn't even know it. No.
So in that same vein, did you have any sense or retrospect now about the trauma of losing their first son and how it impacted their parenting with you?
I think that probably made a huge difference. I think it made them so careful. And I remember, and I didn't quite get it. My sister talked about it, and she sadly died some years ago. She had cancer, but she said that she remembered that my mother would close shutters, not just windows, but shutters. And I didn't even remember that, but she felt that it resonated, and she talked to me a little about it. I actually lost a child just about the same age, little boy, yeah. Many years ago, and my mother was thankfully, my mother was with me and was just wonderful, and talked to me about what that was and what happens and how you sort of lose part of yourself. You have to let that go, and then you're reborn. So it's extraordinary. Yes.
I was wondering if you have heard any comments from your father and or your mother about the film in Spirit of St. Louis. Did they like it, dislike it? Jimmy Stewart was kind of an odd choice to claim.
It's funny. Yeah, I mean, he was in his 50s. He was not a great deal younger than my father was at the time they made the film. But I guess he really wanted to play that part. And he did have a quality. I I understood that. My father got very irritated with there was that business of having, they wanted to have some kind of human interest. And so they had this fly. There was a fly that was in the cockpit, and apparently it really annoyed Jimmy Stewart as well. But they wanted to have the fly for a time. They wanted to have the fly buzz around and wake my father up, and he'd swat it, and it would die, and they buried it at sea. They were going to do. It was getting kind of too much, and finally. Jimmy Stewart said, either the fly goes or I go. And so the fly went out before they really got over the North Atlantic. But they thought, he thought that he said, because he didn't like Hollywood, he didn't like any of that. And so to have this happen, it was hard for him. He decided to do it. And he liked Jimmy Stewart very much. And he actually really liked William Wilder as well. Didn't expect to, but did. And I still love that film. And my mother told me when I was little, the first time we went to see it at Radio City Music Hall, and there were the Rockettes and everything. And she said halfway through, I said, oh, Mother, does he make it? I don't remember that. I enjoyed it. I was completely convinced. Yeah. I liked it. Yeah.
I just finished reading The Aviator's Wife.
Oh, yeah.
and I just wonder what you think of that.
I haven't read it.
You
I haven't read it. I haven't read it because this is a fictional account, and I'm sure it seems to have been well received and well written, and that's just perfectly fine. But I try not to read the fictional because there's just so much already. And if I get mixed up with the fiction, I'm in big trouble.
Is it about your father?
It's about my mother.
Oh, your mother.
Really about their
Oh,
relationship.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Let's have a big hand. Brooks Memorial Library has a remarkable collection of documents and objects and art, as you can see around here. And one of the things we have is this greetings to the citizens of Brattleboro, which was dropped by Charles Lindbergh as he flew over Brattleboro, because, as it said, we regret exceedingly that the limited time and extensive itinerary of the United States tour prevent us from landing in your city. However, they did drop this. It's signed by Charles Lindbergh, and I'll put it over here on the table if you'd like to take a look at it.
Landed in Springfield. That was the only airport. So he landed in these various, at least once in each state, but I think that was the only airport at that time. Springfield, Vermont, the Harkness Airport, I believe.